This video is about speciation, and we're going to look at how a particular species can develop into two separate species and what the theory behind that is. Now, to help us with this idea, we've got an example of a large forest area, and in that forest area we have individuals of species A. Species A could be anything. It could be mice, apes, monkeys, squirrels, anything that might live in that forest. It doesn't have to be a forest. We could be talking lakes, ponds, that kind of thing. But for this example, I'm using the idea of a forest, and we have species A living in there. Now, with species A, as with any species, individuals of that species show variation, and that variation could be little differences between members of the individuals in the population, and often that variation is caused by genes, and specifically it's called by the alleles, the different versions of the genes. So if we were talking about squirrels and fur length, the gene would be for fur length, the alleles might be long fur, short fur, but we can have genes for hundreds of different characteristics, and they all have different alleles for those characteristics. Now, with respect to this idea of speciation, the forest over time, you can imagine, might change, and we're talking, this could be hundreds or thousands of years, but the forest could change over time and eventually split up for whatever reason into two separate forest areas. And this is the first stage in speciation. We call it isolation. That's where the species or the population has been separated by a barrier. The barrier could be just an area of just plain land that these members of the species can't cross because they won't have food or shelter or so on. But the barrier could equally be mountains, it could be the sea, it could be a river, it could be a stream. It doesn't have to be a massive barrier, it could be a small barrier. Depending on the species, it might be enough to keep the population separate. So that's the first stage, isolation. They become separated. Now, as we said, there is genetic variation in the species caused by a range of alleles, but what's also important to remember is that the environment might also be different as well. So we've got environment A and environment B. So this could be a little bit warmer. It could have different types of food, different plants and so on. So there are a whole bunch of features for the two environments that could be different, and that means because we have variation among the individuals, that means the advantageous characteristics for that particular environment are the ones that are going to be passed on. And so if you look at the colors of these as I change slides, you can see I'm just changing the color there just to show that they have changed slightly in their characteristics because of the different environments that they are now living in. And what actually happens is, we call it natural selection. That means the advantageous characteristics caused by the alleles, which we mentioned earlier, are selected. So this is actually for the higher tier. For the foundation tier, you only really need to know up to about here. But if we're going to go into the higher tier, you should be able to talk about this idea of natural selection and how advantageous characteristics that suit the environment are passed on. And we say that these characteristics are selected. If this idea of natural selection is a little bit confusing for you, do have a look back at the video I've done on evolution, which explains it much more slowly and in a little bit more detail than I'm doing here. But for now, natural selection, advantageous features are passed on and selected for in the individuals. And if we carry on, we can see we now have the features that are so different. We say speciation has happened. The species have become too different to interbreed. That means that the changes in the features and the characteristics of all these individuals of the two populations are so different, the species can no longer interbreed. So even if a member of this species were to meet with a member of this species, the differences are so big now that they actually wouldn't be able to interbreed and produce offspring. And that is actually the definition of species. It's members of individuals who can interbreed, and if they can't interbreed, that is a different species. So that's the whole idea of how two different populations can evolve into two different species as a result of this process called speciation. So what I've got here is just a nice little summary of what's actually happened, the parts that you need for higher and the foundation tier, and it's just a summary of how this works. And this you can find on the website under the notes section, and you can download this and use it as you want. It's worth actually finishing off on looking at a famous example of where speciation is thought to have happened, and that's with Darwin's finches, sometimes called Darwin's finches. These are finches that were found on different islands on the what we call the Galapagos Islands. This is where Charles Darwin spent a lot of time gathering evidence, which he took back and wrote about, and actually eventually proposed his theory of evolution. But in terms of these finches, he found that the different finches lived on different islands, and he found that they all had different characteristics, and the key characteristic that he looked at for these particular ones was the beak shape, and he found that the beak shape seemed to be adapted for eating different kinds of food, and this was a result of the different features of different islands, and so the finches evolving and getting characteristics that allowed them to survive, and these characteristics were passed on to make individual species of finches. So that's basically it for this video. This is the last video for B2, so the whole of B2 is now complete. You can look at the website mygcsescience.com, and all the videos are listed there in order, so you can go through the course step by step. But that's it for me for now. That's it for Unit B2 for biology, and I'll see you again for the physics and chemistry videos.